All right, so hands up if you love the changes. Let's bring in our panel. Anthony Lacavera, founder of Wind Mobile and chairman of Global Live Capital, a Toronto-based venture capital firm. Muneeza Sheikh is an employment lawyer and partner at Levitt LLP. Dan Kelly is the president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. They are all joining me from Toronto. Dan Kelly, let me spend a little time with you first. I want to play this clip of the finance minister explaining the new income sprinkling rule. Take a listen.
For those families that are passing some form of their income to family members, children between 18 and 24, their spouse, when they're not involved in the business, that will no longer continue. And for those that are having family members or a spouse working in a smaller way or contributing less capital, they'll work with the Canada Revenue Agency to make sure that their situation is reasonable.
Dan, what's wrong with that? If you have a family member, but they aren't really working for the family business, you can't say that they are. Isn't that logical?
It sounds great to probably a whole bunch of people out there that haven't been involved in family business, but I got to tell you, when you have a business in your family, everybody's involved, whether you like it or not, and at the very least, everybody's involved in taking the risks associated with the business, particularly the business owner's spouse. So it is hard to parse out what one role is and another is in a family business. These are informal roles. Think about a farm. If the husband and wife are running a farm operation, both have some involvement. They're not tracking everybody's hours back and forth. There's no paperwork, perhaps, to suggest the relationship between everybody, and yet they're going to be asked potentially upon audit to prove whether or not the compensation, the dividends that are paid, is reasonable. That's where this breaks down. But look, the government has moved a bit on some of the provisions, provided a touch more clarity, certainly addressed some of the issues around retiring business owners, which is good. The biggest complaint we have, though, is we're 2.5 weeks out from this going into effect, and not a single business owner until today has had any detail as to how they're going to be expected to implement this.
Okay, we do have a clip from, I was going to play it a little later, but I'll play it now since you brought it up, from the finance minister saying, explaining the timeline and also adding in the fact that small businesses will all be getting a tax exemption. Let's play that and then I'll go around the table.
I think all small businesses, 100% of the small businesses across the country, do want us to move forward on January 1st, 2018 with the reduction in tax rates on small businesses. We're committed to doing that. We also know that we have more than enough time for small businesses, if they have their family members in their business, to consider how they might want to give dividends to those family members during the calendar year 2018. They'll have 12 months to figure that out. We think this is entirely appropriate and consistent with past practice.
All right, Dan, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, and then I'll take it to the rest of the panel.
So I'm a business owner and I'm supposed to be paying dividends to my family members or salaries to my family members in January or February. I have no chance to make any changes before that. The minister's saying that we have till the end of 2018 because the taxes are filed in 2019, but some of the payments are going to happen much earlier than that. That offers cold comfort to business owners across Canada, for those that can even figure it out.
All right, let's take it around the table. Anthony, your response to the income sprinkling guidelines and the fact that the new guidelines include an explainer from Canada Revenue Agency as to how it will judge whether you are entitled to use income sprinkling.
You know, Carol, I've got to say there's two major problems from my perspective with what's going on here. The first being they were talking about $220 million of more revenue in government coffers by 2022, 2023. $200 million is a drop in the bucket against the deficits this government is running, upwards of $30 billion with no end in sight. So that's the first big thing, is I have to say, why don't we focus on where there is real revenue opportunities instead of actually grinding away on small business owners and leading to a whole lot more paperwork, a whole lot of more tax accountant costs for small business owners, a whole lot more complexity, really with minuscule benefit to government revenues.
Where would the better revenue, very quickly?
Well, that's just it, right? The second, I mean, this takes me to where should the government be focusing? I mean, they should be focusing on growing share of trade in Asia. Our Prime Minister got shown the door in Beijing a couple of weeks ago with no success. We were on the defensive in the NAFTA negotiation. I mean, these are two very, very important trade relationships that could really drive a lot more jobs and therefore new tax revenues in the Canadian government coffers. So they're just focusing on the wrong things from my perspective.
All right, Muneeza, what do you think?
I think the critics and the opposition have done a phenomenal job in really making a big issue out of something that really is completely in spirit with the commitments that the federal government had made in 2015. I mean, ultimately, in looking at these changes, I completely agree with them, and I strongly believe, from a legal perspective, from a policy perspective, that if you are not contributing to the business in a meaningful way, then ultimately you shouldn't be seeking any benefit. And I think our finance minister made some interesting comments. So, they've carved out a few areas where income sprinkling would still be appropriate, and I won't repeat those. But they also say that if you don't qualify under one of those rules, then we sort of move you over to CRA. And I can tell you as a lawyer, that's where I have a problem, even though I agree with the changes. Because once you go to a regulatory body, the question then becomes, how is the CRA ultimately going to determine what is, equitable contribution, what counts as labor contributions to the business? And I can tell you, legally, I then worry that there's going to be a significant amount of litigation to the extent that people care. There just aren't that many small businesses that are affected, though, Carol. So I don't know. Maybe my worries are unfounded as well.
Dan?
We have 70% of CFIB members across the country that have a family member operating in the business in one fashion or another. And even if the minister's right, and it's only 3% that are ultimately going to see a higher tax bill as a result, that 70% of our members are still going to be having to sit up at night worrying that the auditor is going to come around and saying the bright line test that the government's proposing today for the very first time doesn't apply to them.
How much do you know about the test?
Well, this is just it. The first sign of this was the CRA bulletin that I read today. And I got to tell you, we have tons and tons of tax accountants as members. We've talked to all of the big accounting firms as well. None of them have had any information until today, and yet business owners are expected to implement this in 2.5 weeks. Remember, this is also the busiest possible time of year for business owners, where they can it's make it or break it in the few weeks leading up to Christmas. They couldn't be more insulting to the small business community if they tried.
Do you think? Okay, go ahead, Muneeza.
I really have to say that I disagree with that. I mean, ultimately, if we're looking at any sort of punitive or retaliatory action that's going to be taken against the very few, 50,000 businesses ultimately that will be affected by the income sprinkling. And keep in mind, as I understand it, it's something like only 13% of those 50,000 are seeing a benefit of more than $1,000. So I don't really see the government through CRA cracking down in 2018. I think they're fully cognizant of the fact that it takes time to get things in order. So I can't imagine any sort of punitive action in 2015. And I think that if there was, I think that would look terrible, but I just simply don't see that happening.
Anthony?
I mean, look, we're living in the knowledge economy, the digital economy. Value and assets are portable across borders because their assets are in the form of people. And what we're saying to small business owners that have created the backbone of the economy of this country, the vast majority of the wealth in this country, we're saying, you know what, why don't you take your business elsewhere? We're basically saying to small business owners, you know what, we're going to create such a massive bureaucracy of red tape for you that it's going to be totally unappealing to continue to invest in your business, and you might as well invest in it elsewhere. I really think we need to think about practical, simple solutions to simplifying the tax regime, not making it more complex for business or consumers.
But what about the tax cut for small businesses that the finance minister talks about, Anthony?
Kara, it's such superficial small dollars. Again, we're talking about rounding error dollars here. And the macro picture is we want to encourage more job creation, more wealth creation through job creation, and that requires incentivizing small business owners to grow their business. I mean, we need to talk about how we help business owners grow their business instead of focusing on, rounding errors in tax revenues. The reality is that the Canadian economy is a small part of the global economy, and we're participating in the global economy, and if our tax regime is not competitive here domestically, I mean, the United States is heading towards lower taxes. Mm-hmm. So if we're not competitive globally and we're operating in a global economy, I don't know how we are expecting to be successful long term. So I think our government needs to say, instead of looking inward and let's talk about the issues they've raised this year around fairness, of course I'm fully support us having a tax regime that's fair and that everyone should pay their fair share. And if anyone's trying to cheat the system or trying to circumvent the system, of course they should be paying their fair share.
Dan, how much
we
do
need
small
to be thinking
businesses?
about how we can avoid, limiting that to a lot of people that are paying their fair share.
Dan, what are the taxes and what are the cuts that are coming for small businesses in this country?
Gosh, well, unfortunately, there's a huge number of taxes that are going to be going up in the next couple of years. Now, to the government's credit, after the backlash from small business owners over the course of the summer, they did reinstate the small business tax cut that they had promised originally, then canceled in the 2016 budget. I would have loved that to have gone into effect for 2017 when it was actually scheduled and legislated, but that's water under the bridge. We got to remember, CPP premiums are going up for the next 5 to 7 years. Carbon taxes, carbon pricing going up for the next 5 years in every province across the country. We've got minimum wages in Ontario, Alberta, perhaps British Columbia going up dramatically, 32% here in Ontario. I don't know how many more knocks the small business community can take federally and provincially. And then, of course, we have this big file, the passive income rules that we haven't seen any detail on that we're expecting in the 2018 budget. This leads to a lot of worries. And the government did have an opportunity. They seemed to self-correct in October. They started to get with the program and realize they had overstepped, I think, in terms of some of the attacks that they had made. Unfortunately, though, by delaying this until the bitter end here, not at least allowing a year of implementation time that we had recommended, I don't know that, we took one step forward, 2 steps back.
I mean, I really think we're grinding around the edges. I agree with everything Dan's saying, but a year or not a year, we're sort of grinding around the edges here. We need to be talking about the macro picture where our tax regime had just simply must be globally competitive. There's just no other way to do it.
Muneeza, I'm going to give you the last word.
Thank you for that. I think, again, there's really been a gross misapprehension as to how many businesses are actually affected by this. I mean, someone had talked about superficial dollars. If you want to talk superficial dollars, let's look to see how many businesses are actually going to be affected by this. I can tell you as a lawyer, my understanding is that if you look at these changes, what they've really done is they've honed what was in practice before, which was ultimately, look, if you contribute to the business in some meaningful way and you fall under one of these categories, then you're in. If you don't fall under one of these categories, then somebody from CRA will give you the opportunity to make your case. And I think this goes a little bit to what Dan is talking about, where you have those contributions to a business that maybe can't be quantified or can't be delineated in writing. So I really think this, the opposition and critics have taken a fantastic opportunity to blow this out of proportion. I think our finance minister did a wonderful job of explaining exactly why the changes are important.
A lot more faith in CRA than me.
All right.
Agreed.
We'll leave it on that note. Anthony, Muneeza, and Dan, thank you so much.
Thanks, Carol.